We're not asking for the world here. We're asking for a few days off a month to spend with our family instead of living on a train. We spend 240 to 260 hours a month sitting on these trains or sitting at the hotel rooms away from our families.
I love how shocked and surprised conservative hosts are when they hear from workers who are about to strike because they don't have great working conditions, but more importantly, they don't get paid time off. And in this case, they were specifically speaking to a rail worker, and there's good reason for having this discussion. We got to keep in mind that rail workers are planning on striking as soon as Friday of this week. And I'll tell you why in just a moment. But just to break down that video even further, the whole point of that conversation was to bring up the fact that the railroad workers are not willing to accept what the terms of the latest negotiation with their employers have been. There are 12 major railroad companies that are about to lose workers to a strike later this week because they're unwilling to change the fact that they aren't giving these workers enough time off to deal with illnesses, family emergencies. I'm going to give you the details to all of that in just a moment, but I do think it's important to watch the rest of that Newsmax video. So let's take a look.
David, we did reach out to the Association of American Railroads, and they say that workers get sick days and paid time off.
Whoever told you we get our sick days is manipulating the data. We get paid time off that we earned the previous year before. Before the new policy came about, we were allowed to take 5 days off and 2 weekend days off a month. Now we could take virtually 1 day unpaid off a month. And then the only other time we could take off is our paid time that we had to earn the previous year.
Yeah, that does seem ridiculous. They would never let airline pilots do that. Is that issue number one for members of the unions?
100% is number one.
So here's an update on what's currently happening with the railroad workers, their employers, and where the current negotiations are at. As we've shared on the show before, railroad workers have been threatening to strike, and the White House actually intervened to prevent that strike from happening. And the reason why the Biden administration would want to intervene is because, of course, railroad workers striking would be a massive disruption to the economy. And that kind of disruption, especially so close to the midterms, would be a disaster for the Democrats since they're in charge right now. Now, as I mentioned, the railroad workers are potentially going to strike later this week unless Congress gets involved and basically prevents them from doing it. But before I give you the details to that, let me give you the details on the terms of the negotiation that the railroad workers have rejected. So the negotiations did lead to a proposed pay increase, which is pretty significant, right? Now, that's not enough, though, because these are individuals who are working incredibly long hours. Oftentimes, they don't see their own family members for weeks and weeks and weeks. And so they want to be able to spend more time with their families, which is understandable. They want time off in case they are sick. And unfortunately, right now, they only get 1 day in some of these railroad companies, right? The workers get maybe 1 day off per week for, let's say, an emergency or an illness. And clearly that's not enough, right? And so if the strike happens, as I mentioned, it could have major ramifications for the economy. The Biden administration has been pretty aggressive in trying to do something about inflation. And as recent reports indicate, inflation is still very much a problem. I think that there are multiple factors that are leading to inflation in different sectors of the economy. We've talked about that before. But I do want to mention that if a negotiation has not been reached by Friday, they will strike. After that, those unions can legally strike, a move that could drive transportation costs higher, stall commutes and gum up shipments of coal, chemicals, cars, and grain, and cost $2 billion a day by one estimate. Okay, so again, those are the ramifications for the economy, which this is where workers' power really lies, when they're able to bring companies to their knees by doing a strike like this. Now, how much will this have a toll on the economy? Well, depending on how you want to measure it, the railroads at some point touch between about a third to about 45% of all freight in the U.S. at some point or another. Okay, so let's pause for a second. That's a quote from Jason Miller, who's a professor over at Michigan State University. If you know that the nation's economy literally relies on these workers, there are as many as 100,000 rail workers involved here, right? Just give them more time off. They're not, as far as I understand it, by the way, they're not even asking for more paid time off per month to deal with family emergencies or sicknesses. They just want more unpaid time off, meaning workers have been retaliated against if they need to take more time off, unpaid, which is crazy. Now, the White House has already gotten involved, as I mentioned earlier. The White House is reportedly speaking with ocean shipping, truck, and air freight providers to explore ways to keep goods flowing. But filling a railroad network-sized gap in the economy could be a tough task. And this is where the $2 billion number comes in. It could cost as much as $2 billion a day just to do that. And that's according to the Association of American Railroads. It's an industry group. And while I do think that it will be costly for the economy, you should also be a little dubious of that $2 billion a day number, because this is essentially the industry trying to encourage Congress to step in and essentially prevent the strikers from being able to strike. And there is precedent for that. Now, the association estimated that it would take 467,000 long haul trucks daily to haul what the railroads do. There simply aren't enough trucks or truck drivers to handle that volume, it said in the report. And that I do believe. As we know, there was already an issue with a shortage of truck drivers. And so the idea that truckers can fill that gap left behind by striking railroad workers is insane. And I would probably venture to say that some of the truckers probably wouldn't want to, go against the striking workers and fill the so-called gaps. Now, again, that responsibility to fill the gaps would fall on the truckers. Now, why haven't the railroad companies been able to reach this deal? Again, the main issue was leave, and they've already agreed on the percentage increase in pay. So in July, President Joe Biden intervened to avert a strike, naming a panel of arbitrators to mediate the contract disputes. The panel last month issued a 124-page report recommending a 24% pay increase, sounds pretty good, and bonuses through 2024, along with back pay through much of 2020. Now, that satisfied the railroads and has tentatively been good enough for 10 out of the 12 labor unions. But the two labor unions that have decided, no, we're going to reject this, are specifically calling on more time off. Okay, so the remaining holdouts, the Brother of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen, and the International Association of Steel, Metal, Air, Rail, and Transportation Workers, account for well above half the rail labor force. They say they want any agreement to address what they say are strict attendance, sick, and time off policies. That's all it takes at this point. Okay, that is literally all it takes to avoid a strike. Basically, 3 out of the 12 unions representing these workers have already voted in favor of doing this strike by the end of the week. Again, the only thing that the employers need to do is agree to provide more time off for these workers so they can deal with life, something that we all have to deal with, right? So I think it's totally reasonable. And so I should note that the two remaining holdouts when it comes to the negotiations so far were the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen and the International Association of Sheet Metal, Air, Rail, and Transportation Workers. They account for well above half of the rail labor force. They say they want any agreement to address what they say are strict attendance, sick, and time off policies. And again, incredibly reasonable. And instead of just providing this one final demand to the workers, who, by the way, without those workers, economy goes to crap. Without those workers, no revenue, okay, for the employers here. All they need to do is the bare minimum. They've already agreed to the pay increase of 24%. They've already agreed to back pay. Just give them the time off that they need. And instead of doing that, so far, by the way, we're hearing that they're hoping that Congress will intervene and essentially prevent these workers from striking. They're trying to force congressional intervention. Analysts over at JP Morgan are telling investors, now's a great time to invest in railroad companies because there's no way Congress won't intervene. And it gives you a sense of what Congress is really meant for in neoliberal politics. In neoliberalism, the government isn't there to protect you, the worker. The government is there to protect corporate interests. And that's what we see play out over and over again. And while the Biden administration really wants to position itself as, a pro-labor administration, and to be sure, to be fair, Biden and his NLRB have certainly been better than administrations in recent decades, which isn't saying much. It's a low bar. I would have liked to see the Biden administration actually apply the pressure to the railroad companies to ensure that these workers get the time off that they need. Okay, that's what's important to do here. And as I mentioned earlier, there is precedent for Congress stepping in. So the June 1992 railroad strike lasted for 2 days before Congress passed a bill banning strikes and lockouts. That was signed by George H.W. Bush at the time. And then you have lawmakers who have used the Railway Labor Act of 1926 to intervene at least 11 times since 1963. So again, it's not unprecedented for Congress to get involved, but I would really like to see Democrats put their money where their mouth is. They love to campaign on supporting the workers and doing right by them. How about you actually put those words into action, and instead of intervening to prevent the strike from happening, you apply pressure to the employers to agree to this one final thing, which I know this is like the billionth time I've said it, is incredibly reasonable.